Chosen one. You're not abandoned. You're in the operating room, and nobody gets to walk into an operating room except the surgeon and the patient, not because you don't matter, but because this procedure matters too much to be interrupted. The silence you've been living in isn't his absence, that's his concentration. And the sooner you understand the difference, the sooner you stop bleeding from a wound that was never meant to kill you. Here's the thing. The loneliness you've been carrying around like a verdict was never a verdict. It was a preparation protocol. And there's a difference so significant between those two things that getting it wrong has cost you months, maybe years. You've been reading your situation through the wrong lens, and when you're using the wrong lens, even the right thing looks like a mistake. You've watched people around you move, get promoted, get seen, get celebrated. And somewhere in the gap between their timeline and yours, a question started forming. A quiet, persistent, dangerous question. What's wrong with me? Nothing. Nothing is wrong with you. But something is happening to you, and it's not what you think it is. Let's establish something right now. What you're experiencing isn't chaos. It's not the fallout of bad decisions, though some decisions may have needed correcting. It's not the consequence of not being enough, though the old version of you believed that story for longer than it deserved. What you're experiencing is a mechanism, and mechanisms have sequence, purpose, and a completion point. That distinction matters more than anything else you'll hear today, because a person who mistakes a mechanism for a punishment will spend all their energy trying to escape something they were supposed to move through. Think about what a surgeon actually does. Before a single incision is made, there's a diagnosis, a clear-eyed, unemotional assessment of what's present, what's damaged, and what needs to be restructured. The surgeon doesn't enter the room feeling sorry for the patient. The surgeon enters the room with a plan. The surgeon, looking at your life right now, isn't confused, isn't improvising, and isn't working from a place of disappointment. He's operating with a precision that your current vantage point lying on the table staring at the ceiling can't fully appreciate yet. Stay with me. Here's what nobody tells you. The most disorienting part of being in the operating room isn't the pain. It's the ceiling. You're staring up at a ceiling you didn't choose in a room you didn't plan to be in, surrounded by a silence that feels indistinguishable from being forgotten. And the only thing that separates a patient who surrenders to the procedure from one who panics and tears out the IV is understanding what is happening, understanding why the room had to be cleared, and understanding why silence is the sound of someone working, not someone leaving. That understanding is what this chapter is about. Now, watch this. There's a moment in every person's story where the world they built stops fitting them, not because they failed at building it, but because they succeeded. They outgrew the blueprint. And when a structure is too small for what it was designed to contain, one of two things happens. It cracks under pressure, or it gets intentionally deconstructed by hands that know exactly what they're doing. You've been feeling the deconstruction, the relationships that quietly dissolved the environments that started suffocating you, the conversations that suddenly felt like noise instead of nourishment. You didn't fully choose any of that. It felt like it was choosing you. That's not dysfunction. That's diagnosis. Take a breath right now, not a rushed one, the kind that tells your system, I'm still here. Because what we're doing in this video isn't building you up with language designed to make the pain feel smaller than it is. That's not what you came here for, and honestly, that's not what you need. What you need is a name for what's been happening. Because unnamed things have power over us. Named things, we can work with those, we can orient around those, we can stop running from those and start moving through them with intention. The surgeon identified what needed to be addressed long before you had language for it. He moved first, not out of impatience, not out of punishment, but out of a precision so complete that it required your cooperation even before you understood what you were cooperating with. Think about that. You've been cooperating with a process you couldn't see, in a direction you couldn't name, toward an outcome you couldn't yet imagine, and you stayed. You didn't disappear entirely. You didn't collapse. You stayed even when staying felt identical to being stuck. Chosen one. This is the diagnosis. You're not being punished. You're not being benched. You're not invisible because you're irrelevant. You're in the operating room, lights on, instruments sterile, the surgeon focused. And the procedure that's been underway, the one that has felt like isolation and like watching everyone else move from behind glass, it has a direction, a purpose, and a completion point that's far closer than the ceiling you've been staring at would suggest. This isn't the explanation you came looking for, it's the one you needed, and we're just getting started. So you're in the operating room, you know that now. But here's what happens to almost everyone who reaches this point. They understand the procedure intellectually, and then they walk back into the world, and the world hands them a different story, a louder story, a story that's been running so long it feels like truth. And if you don't learn to recognize that story for what it is, it will cost you more time than the isolation ever did. Because the isolation was the surgeon's work. But the lie is the infection that sneaks in after. Here's the thing. The world has a very specific theology about what success looks like, and it goes something like this. The person winning is the person who's always visible, always connected, always in the room, always on the call, always at the table. Presence equals power. Access equals value. And by that metric, the season you've been in, quiet, withdrawn, restructuring in the dark, reads as failure. It reads as falling behind. The old version of you absorbed that metric without questioning it, and that absorption is exactly where the bleeding started. Let's name this clearly. The lie isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with obvious malice. It arrives as a comparison, someone else's highlight against your silence. It arrives as a question from someone who means well. So what are you doing these days? And in the space between that question and your answer, the lie does its work. It tells you that nothing is happening. It tells you that you've been still too long. It tells you that the people still moving in that old orbit have something figured out that you missed. That's the infection, and you've been letting it sit in the wound. Now watch this. Your body has an immune system. And one of the most sophisticated things that immune system does is isolate foreign material. It identifies what doesn't belong to the organism's current structure, and it walls it off, keeps it from spreading, prevents it from integrating with tissue that's meant for something else. That process isn't the body failing. That's the body at its most intelligent. That's the body doing exactly what a healthy system does when it encounters something that would compromise its integrity. What's been happening in your life, the quiet falling away of people, environments, conversations, and opportunities that no longer match your frequency, that isn't your social life deteriorating. That's your spiritual immune system functioning at full capacity. Stay with me, because this is where most people miss it. They feel the separation happening, and they interpret it as loss. They reach back for what's leaving, because loss feels like something that needs to be corrected. But not every departure is a loss. Some departures are the body removing what would have caused a rejection reaction down the line. Some of the people who left the rooms that stopped opening, the roles that stopped fitting, they weren't taken from you. They were isolated from you by a system smarter than your feelings in that moment. Think about that. Here's what the world calls abandonment and what the surgeon calls sterilization. Here's what the world calls stagnation and what the surgeon calls consolidation. Here's what the world calls being left behind and what the surgeon calls being prepared for a load that what came before couldn't carry. These aren't just reframes, they're anatomically different diagnoses, and the treatment for each one is completely opposite. If you treat sterilization like abandonment, you'll spend all your energy rebuilding what was supposed to be cleared. You'll keep reintroducing the infection. You'll wonder why the wound won't close. Take a breath right now, slow, because this next part matters. There's a difference between growing and maintaining, and from the outside they look identical. Both involve showing up. Both involve effort. Both involve presence in a space. But growing means the space is producing something new in you, new capacity, new clarity, new structural integrity. Maintaining means you're holding a shape that no longer belongs to the person you're becoming. You can be fully present, fully active, fully visible, and still just be maintaining. And deep down, if you're honest, you knew the difference. You knew which rooms were growing you and which ones you were just surviving. You didn't leave because you were weak. You left or were led out because something in you recognized the distinction even when your mind hadn't caught up yet. Chosen one. The most dangerous lie isn't what other people have said about your silence. It's the story you started telling yourself when the applause stopped and the room got quiet. That story, the one that said you were falling behind, that said you'd miscalculated that, said the people still moving in familiar circles had something you'd lost. That story was never evidence. It was static. And now that you can name it, you can stop bleeding from it. Because you can't heal a wound you keep insisting isn't there. The lie has been named. You know what the infection looks like now. But here's where it gets more personal and more precise. Because it's one thing to understand that the separation was necessary in the abstract. It's another thing entirely to sit with the specific faces, the specific names, the specific rooms that went quiet. And if you're carrying guilt about any of those, if there's a part of you that still wonders whether you handled it wrong, whether you were too cold, whether you pulled back when you should have stayed, this chapter is the one that speaks directly to that weight. Because that guilt, it's not conviction, it's confusion. And confusion dressed up as conscience has kept more people spiritually paralyzed than almost anything else. Here's the thing, not everyone who left your life was your enemy. Let's be completely clear about that. Some of them were good people, some of them genuinely cared about you, some of them would have stayed if you'd asked. And that's precisely what makes this particular aspect of the separation so difficult to process, because it's easy to release what was clearly harmful. It's much harder to release what was simply no longer aligned. The surgeon doesn't only remove infected tissue. Sometimes he removes healthy tissue that belongs to a different system, not because it was bad, because it was designed for a version of you that the procedure is in the process of replacing. Stay with me. There's a medical concept that most people don't think about until they need surgery, and it's the concept of the sterile field. Before a surgeon makes a single incision, everything in that operating environment is meticulously cleared of contamination. Not because the instruments were evil, not because the room had bad intentions, but because the procedure requires an environment where nothing foreign can interfere with what's being repaired. A sterile field isn't a cold place, it's a protected place. And the distinction between those two things is everything. The people who left the rooms that closed the access that quietly revoked itself. The surgeon wasn't making a judgment about their worth. He was maintaining the sterile field required for what he was about to do in you. Some of them couldn't be in the room, not because they failed you, but because their presence, even their well-meaning, genuinely caring presence, would have introduced variables that the procedure couldn't accommodate. Think about that slowly. Their absence wasn't their punishment, and it wasn't your rejection of them. It was the operating environment doing what operating environments must do to protect what's being healed. Now watch this. You've probably sat in a meeting or across from someone at dinner or in a group chat that used to feel like home, and you noticed that something had shifted. You couldn't explain it. The words were the same. The dynamic looked familiar. But something inside you had stopped resonating with it, like a frequency that had moved outside the range you could still receive. And instead of trusting that signal, you spent energy trying to get back in tune with something you'd outgrown. You smiled wider. You showed up harder. You made yourself available in ways that quietly cost you, because the alternative was admitting that you no longer belonged in that room. And admitting that felt like arrogance. So you stayed. And the staying drained what the separation was supposed to protect. Here's what nobody tells you about guilt in a season like this. Guilt is an appropriate response when you've caused harm. But what many people are carrying right now isn't guilt for harm caused, it's guilt for a growth that made others uncomfortable. Those are not the same thing. One requires repentance, the other requires discernment. And treating the second one like the first one will have you apologizing for your own becoming, which is one of the most spiritually expensive habits a person can develop. Take a breath right now. Not a justifying one, not the breath you take when you're building a case for yourself. The kind you take when you're finally setting something down that your hands were never meant to carry permanently. Because you've been holding the weight of other people's experience of your transformation as though their discomfort with your shift was evidence that the shift was wrong. It wasn't. Their discomfort was simply the sterile field doing its work on their side of the glass. You weren't stationed in those environments forever. You were positioned there by assignment for a season that had a start date and an end date, even if no one announced either one. Your presence was never theirs to own. It was the surgeon's to command. And when the season completed, the room was cleared, not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the quiet precision of a procedure that knew exactly what it was doing. Chosen one. The guilt ends here. Not because you're absolved of the responsibility to love people well, you are called to that and you know it, but because love and proximity are not the same thing. You can honor someone's place in your story without letting that story become the room you're still living in. The sterile field was necessary. The clearing was intentional. And the room being empty right now isn't a sign that something went wrong. It's a sign that the surgeon is about to begin. The room has been cleared, the sterile field is established, and now something shifts in the procedure because what comes next isn't passive. It requires your participation, not the frantic prove-yourself kind of participation that the old version of you defaulted to. The quiet, discerning kind. The kind that knows the difference between a cut that's constructive and a cut that's destructive. Because here's where a lot of people in this season make the critical error. They feel pain and they immediately try to stop it. They don't ask what kind of pain it is. They just try to make it stop. And in doing so, they interrupt the very thing that was working. Here's the thing. Not all pain is the same. A surgeon makes an incision and a patient feels it, but that incision, precise and intentional, is categorically different from a wound caused by neglect or harm. The incision has a direction. It has a purpose. It creates a temporary opening so that something deeper can be reached and repaired. The wound from neglect just bleeds without destination. And if you can't tell the difference between those two in real time, if every uncomfortable feeling registers in your nervous system as danger, then you'll spend this entire season flinching away from the instrument that's trying to heal you. Let's build a framework you can actually use. There are two kinds of pain in a season of separation, and your ability to distinguish them is one of the most important skills you'll develop in this chapter of your life. The first is what we'll call surgical pain. It has direction. It has a discernible edge you can feel where it begins and roughly where it ends. And when it passes, it leaves behind a specific kind of clarity. Not happiness necessarily, but clarity. A sense that something which needed to shift has shifted. The second kind is infectious pain. It spreads without clear boundary. It doesn't produce clarity, it produces fog. It exhausts you without moving you forward, and it almost always has the same source. You're holding on to something that was identified for release, and the holding is what's causing the inflammation. Now watch this. You've made a decision recently, maybe a financial one, maybe relational, maybe professional, and in the aftermath, you noticed a particular quality to how you felt. Not relief exactly, but a kind of clean emptiness, like a drawer that had been overfull and is now organized. That sensation, that specific quiet spaciousness, is what surgical pain leaves behind when it's allowed to complete. Most people don't recognize it as a good sign because it doesn't feel triumphant. It just feels like less. And in a culture that equates more with better less, feels suspicious. But that spaciousness is the operating theater after a successful procedure. It's room being made for what comes next. Here's what that looks like in practice. You're offered a financial opportunity. The numbers are real. The timeline is credible. The person presenting it is someone you've worked with before. But something in you hesitates. Not fear of failure, not insecurity about your capacity. Something more specific, more directional. A quiet signal that says this particular thing at this particular moment would cost you more than the number on the offer. That signal is the incision being read. The old version of you overrode it because the approval felt good, or the money felt necessary, or the relationship felt too valuable to risk with a no. But the you that's been in this operating room, that version, has learned to trust the signal over the noise. Saying no in that moment won't feel victorious. It'll feel like loss, clean loss, surgical loss. And 48 hours later, you'll notice the spaciousness. Stay with me. The same principle applies in rooms with people. You're in a conversation with someone who used to have significant access to your internal world, your doubts, your plans, your developing ideas. And you notice that the conversation is pulling at something in you, not feeding it, pulling at it, like a stitch being tugged before the wound has fully closed. The discernment you need in that moment isn't complicated. It's just honest. Is this conversation producing clarity or producing fog? Is this leaving me lighter or heavier? You don't have to end the relationship. You just have to stop letting every interaction reach the wound. Think about that. Surgical pain leaves spaciousness. Infectious pain leaves fog. One is the surgeon working. The other is the sterile field being compromised. Your job in this season isn't to eliminate discomfort, it's to read it accurately. Because the moment you can tell the difference between a cut that's healing you and a wound that's draining you, you stop being a passive patient on the table. You become someone who understands the procedure well enough to cooperate with it intelligently. Chosen one. The incision is readable. You've been feeling it for longer than you've had language for it. Now you have the language. And language changes everything, because a thing you can name is a thing you can navigate, not just survive. You can read the incision now. You know the difference between surgical pain and infectious pain. But knowing the difference and staying still through the procedure are two entirely separate competencies. And this is where the gap lives for most people in this season, not in understanding, but in the doing. Because the moment the pressure builds, the moment the silence stretches past comfortable, the moment someone in your orbit gets something you've been waiting for, the instinct to move kicks in. Hard. And that instinct unchecked will undo more progress than any external obstacle ever could. Here's the thing. A patient who understands their diagnosis but panics on the table doesn't understand it as deeply as they think. Understanding that lives in the mind only is not the same as understanding that has settled into the body, into the reflexes, into the automatic responses that fire before the conscious mind catches up. The work of this chapter is building the second kind of understanding, the kind that holds you still, not because you're passive, but because you're disciplined. Not because you're defeated, but because you know exactly what's at stake when you move before the procedure is complete. There are 3 reflexes that surface in a season of separation, and all 3 of them feel justified in the moment. The first is the reflex to explain. Something shifts in you. You pull back from a room or a relationship or a role, and immediately the pressure to account for that shift starts building. From others, yes, but mostly from yourself. You want the withdrawal to make sense to the people watching. You want your silence to be contextualized so it doesn't get misread. And so you start constructing the explanation, rehearsing it, offering pieces of it in conversations where it was never asked for. Here's what that costs you. Every explanation you offer is energy redirected away from the procedure. Every time you climb off the table to address the audience, the incision is exposed to the open air. The surgeon doesn't explain his work mid-operation. Neither should you. The second reflex is the reflex to fill. Silence is uncomfortable for a nervous system that has been conditioned by noise. When the familiar sounds disappear, the notifications, the group chats, the social validation loops, the constant low hum of being needed, the system reads that silence as a threat and immediately goes looking for a substitute, a new project, a new connection, a new source of external input to replace what's been cleared. And the problem isn't activity itself. The problem is activity chosen not because it's the next right thing, but because the quiet was too loud. That kind of filling doesn't move you forward, it just postpones the work. Stay with me. The third reflex is the most dangerous one. It's the reflex to compare. You look at someone still operating in the old orbit. The orbit the surgeon moved you out of, and they're visible, they're active, they're accumulating. And the question surfaces, why are they advancing while you're in here? Why does their timeline seem uninterrupted while yours has been placed under construction? This is the moment that requires the sharpest discipline, because comparison doesn't just distract you, it reframes the entire procedure as a disadvantage. It takes what the surgeon designed as elevation and relabels it as delay. And once that relabeling takes hold, you start cooperating with the wrong story. Now watch this. You're in a professional environment and a colleague receives recognition for work you know you contributed to. The room looks to you for a reaction. Your pulse registers the moment. Everything in your nervous system wants to either claim the contribution or minimize the sting with performance. Here's what staying still looks like in that room. You let the moment pass through you without attaching to it. Not because you don't have dignity, because your timeline isn't being graded on that exchange. Your procedure isn't running on their calendar. The spaciousness you feel after choosing stillness in that moment, that's the anesthesia working correctly. Think about that. Stillness isn't the absence of strength. It's strength operating at a frequency that doesn't require noise to confirm itself. The instruction given to the people standing at the edge of the sea, "Be still and watch what he does," wasn't a call to passivity. It was a call to the highest form of active trust, remaining in position while the procedure completes. Chosen one. The knife is still moving. The procedure isn't finished. And the most powerful thing you can do right now in this exact season isn't to push forward. It's to stay exactly where the surgeon placed you, present, surrendered, and completely still. You've stayed still. You've learned to read the incision. You've resisted the 3 reflexes that would have compromised the sterile field. And now something has shifted in the operating room because the most intense part of the procedure is behind you. The acute pressure has lifted. The silence isn't as sharp as it was. And there's a new sensation starting to surface, something that almost feels like stability, almost feels like ground under your feet again. This is the moment most people exhale and assume the work is done. It isn't. Because what you do in recovery determines more about your outcome than what you did on the table. The operating room required your surrender. The recovery room requires your stewardship. And those are 2 completely different assignments. Here's the thing. The most common failure point in a season like this isn't the breaking down, it's the too early standing up. A structure that's been surgically restructured needs time to consolidate before it accepts load. That's not a metaphor. That's physiology. Bone that's been reset needs weeks before it can bear weight. Tissue that's been repaired needs time before it can be stretched. The timeline isn't punishment, it's physics. And ignoring physics because you feel better than you did last month is one of the most sophisticated forms of self-sabotage available to someone in your position. Let's define what this recovery phase actually feels like from the inside, because it has a very specific texture. You're no longer in the acute pain of the separation, but you're not yet in the full momentum of what's coming. There's a quality to this period that feels like standing in a doorway, one hand still on the frame of what was one foot already pointed toward what's next. The temptation in the doorway is to rush through it, to treat the reduction in pain as a green light for full acceleration. But the doorway has its own work, and the person who learns to do the doorway work slowly, deliberately, without performing their recovery for an audience, that person walks into the next season with a structural integrity that the rushed version never develops. Now, watch this. Recovery has 3 specific practices, and each one addresses a different dimension of what the surgeon has been rebuilding. The first is vertical replenishment, not horizontal expansion. The old pattern was to seek input from width, more people, more opinions, more external sources of direction. Vertical replenishment means going deep before going wide. It means spending 30 minutes with your own interior before you spend 3 hours with other people's content. It means letting the surgeon's voice be the first architecture your mind encounters in the morning before the noise of the world has a chance to lay its own blueprint over yours. This isn't just spiritual discipline. It's structural protection for everything that was just rebuilt. The second practice is load testing before load bearing. Before you accept a new responsibility, a new relationship, a new financial commitment, or a new public role, ask the honest question: does my current structure have the capacity to carry this, or am I accepting it because waiting feels indistinguishable from stagnating? Here's what that looks like in practice. Someone approaches you with a partnership that requires your time, your name, and your relational capital. The offer is credible, the person is genuine, but something in your system hesitates, not with the cold signal of an incision being read, but with the quieter signal of a structure saying, "Not yet." Honoring that signal isn't timidity. It's the most sophisticated form of stewardship available to you right now. Stay with me. The third practice is tending the wound without hiding it. Recovery isn't performance. You're not required to present wholeness to the world before wholeness is actual. The dangerous habit in this phase is covering the healing process with the appearance of having already healed, staying busy enough that nobody asks questions, projecting confidence into rooms where the confidence is still consolidating. That's not strength. That's a dressing over an unfinished wound. And dressed wounds that aren't actually cleaned develop complications that take longer to treat than the original injury. Take a breath right now, a slow one. Let this settle. You've come through something real. The procedure was real. The sterile field, the incision, the stillness required, all of it was real. And the person standing on this side of it is not the same structure that walked in. That matters. It means what you're being asked to carry next will be carried differently, handled differently, stewarded differently. Chosen one recovery isn't waiting. It's building the exact foundation that everything coming next will stand on. Don't rush it. Don't perform it. Don't apologize for it. The surgeon completed his part. Now do yours. Recovery has done its work. The structure has consolidated. And now something begins to emerge that couldn't have existed before the procedure, not because it was absent in you, but because it hadn't been forged yet. There's a quality that surfaces in people who've been through the operating room and stayed the course through recovery, and it's unmistakable to anyone paying attention. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require a platform or a title or a room full of people to confirm it. It simply exists, steady, unhurried, immovable, in a way that performance never quite manages to replicate. That quality is authority, not the borrowed kind, the kind that's been earned in the dark, in the silence, in the seasons nobody photographed. Here's the thing. There are two completely different structures that wear the same name. The first is borrowed authority. It sits on top of a title, a position, a network, a reputation built in a specific environment. It's real while the environment holds, but the moment the environment shifts, borrowed authority shifts with it. The person who had it scrambles to relocate it, to rebuild it somewhere new, to find another structure to attach it to. You've watched this happen. You've probably experienced a version of it yourself in the old season, the way your sense of legitimacy was tied to a room that no longer exists. The second kind is earned authority. It doesn't live in any environment. It lives in the scar tissue. And scar tissue, by definition, is stronger than the original. Now watch this. When a bone breaks and heals correctly, the healed site is denser than the surrounding bone. The fracture point becomes the strongest point. This isn't inspirational language, it's structural fact. And the same principle operates in the interior life of a person who's been through genuine surgical separation and genuine recovery. The places that were cut, cleared, and rebuilt are not your weaknesses. They're your densest material. They're the parts of you that have already been tested at load capacity and held. And that density, that specific, unperformable solidity is what other people feel when they're in the room with you, even when they can't articulate what they're responding to. Here's what that looks like in a real environment. You walk into a negotiation. The other side has prepared pressure tactics, artificial urgency, strategic ambiguity, the kind of manufactured tension designed to push someone into a decision before they're ready. The person who hasn't been through the operating room feels that pressure and responds to it because their authority is borrowed and borrowed authority is always slightly anxious. You sit across that table having spent months learning to stay still under a knife. Manufactured urgency reads differently to you now. You recognize it not as reality, but as technique. And your stillness in the face of it, unhurried, undefended, completely unimpressed, repositions the entire dynamic without a single aggressive word. That's not a personality trait. That's a scar doing its structural work. Stay with me. The same dynamic operates in leadership. There's a moment in every team, every organization, every relational structure where something goes wrong and the room looks for someone to hold. Not someone with the right title, someone with the right density, someone whose reaction to the pressure reveals that they've been under greater pressure before and didn't collapse. That person doesn't need to speak first or speak loudest. Their presence already communicates what their words will confirm. And you cannot manufacture that communication. You cannot rehearse it into existence or perform it convincingly enough to sustain. It either comes from the scar or it doesn't come at all. Think about that. The season you've been in, the one that felt like invisibility, like being removed from relevance, like watching from the outside while others occupied the rooms you thought you were meant for that season, was producing this. Not just character in the abstract sense, structural density in the specific, functional, applicable sense. The kind that holds under load. The kind that doesn't flinch at pressure. It's already survived in a more concentrated form. Here's what nobody tells you about the transition out of the operating room. The world won't hold a ceremony to mark it. Nobody will hand you a credential with the date of your emergence. The shift will be quiet, almost unremarkable from the outside. But inside the rooms you start entering, there will be a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes unmistakable, where the dynamic adjusts to accommodate something in you that wasn't there before. Not your ambition, your solidity. And the people who've been in those rooms long enough will feel it before they can name it. Chosen one. Your scar isn't something to minimize or explain away. It's your most legitimate credential, the one that can't be printed, purchased, or performed. The surgeon didn't just heal you, he made you denser. And density in a world full of borrowed authority is its own kind of rare. The scar is a credential. The density is real. And now the conversation shifts into territory that most spiritual content either avoids entirely or handles with such vagueness that it produces no actual traction in a person's life. We're going to talk about money, about opportunity, about the material dimension of what happens when a restructured person re-enters the world with a rebuilt interior. Because the operating room wasn't just preparing you for deeper wisdom or quieter peace, it was preparing you for greater weight. And weight in practical life arrives with a financial signature. The question isn't whether resources are coming. The question is whether your structure can receive them without being destabilized by them. Here's the thing, money doesn't follow luck. It doesn't follow charisma, and it doesn't follow need. Over any sustained period of time, money follows structure. It flows toward people and systems that can hold it, multiply it, and direct it without being owned by it. The reason the surgeon spent so long rebuilding your interior before expanding your exterior is precisely this. A person whose identity is still attached to lack, whose decisions are still driven by the anxiety of not having enough, whose sense of worth still fluctuates with their account balance, cannot be trusted with the kind of resource that's being prepared for this next season. Not because they're unworthy as a person, because the structure isn't load-bearing yet, and the surgeon doesn't release the harvest until the barn has been rebuilt. Now watch this. There's a specific test that arrives early in the post-recovery season, and almost everyone encounters it in some form. It comes dressed as opportunity. It has a credible face, a compelling number, a timeline that creates just enough pressure to bypass careful discernment. And the test isn't whether the opportunity is real. Often it is. The test is whether you can evaluate it from your rebuilt structure rather than from your old hunger. Because your old hunger, the hunger that accumulated during the long months of the operating room, is still present. It's just quieter now. And quiet hunger is more dangerous than loud hunger because you don't notice it shaping your decisions until the decision has already been made. Here's what that looks like in practice. A former contact reaches out. They have a project that needs your name, your network, or your specific competency. The financial offer is genuine. But as you sit with it, something in your rebuilt structure sends a signal, not the cold, sharp signal of an incision being read, but a slower, structural signal. The kind that says, this load accepted right now would require you to operate from a version of yourself that the procedure just finished retiring. You'd have to perform old patterns, inhabit old postures, negotiate from a position that no longer reflects your actual interior. The money is real. The cost is realer. Turning that down isn't spiritual arrogance. It isn't naivety about how the world works. It's the highest expression of stewardship available to you in that moment, because stewardship isn't just about managing what you have. It's about protecting the structure that will determine what you can eventually hold. Stay with me. A container that accepts more than its current integrity can support doesn't become wealthier. It cracks, and cracks in the wrong season set back the entire reconstruction. Take a breath right now, because this next part requires honesty. Some of the financial pressure you've been carrying hasn't been about money. It's been about evidence. It's been the need to show yourself, your family, the people who watched your quiet season with skepticism, that the operating room was worth it, that the time wasn't wasted, that you're not behind, and that need, legitimate as it feels, will rush you into accepting loads your structure can't yet carry simply to produce visible proof of progress. That's not stewardship, that's performance. And the surgeon didn't rebuild your interior so you could perform for an audience that was never qualified to evaluate the procedure anyway. Think about that. The person who emerges from genuine restructuring and manages their first significant post-recovery opportunities with patience, with discernment, with the willingness to say, not this one, when the signal says not this one, that person builds something that compounds. Quietly at first, then unmistakably, because the foundation is load-bearing in a way that hurried structures never are. Chosen one. The harvest is real and it's coming, but the surgeon releases it to the barn, not to the hunger. Make sure what he finds when he looks at your structure is something built to hold what's about to be placed in it. The barn is being built, the structure is load-bearing, and now comes the moment the entire procedure has been preparing you for re-entry. Not the tentative, apologetic kind of re-entry that asks permission to take up space again. The kind that moves from a rebuilt center, carries no residue of the old posture, and doesn't require the room's reaction to confirm that the procedure was worth it. This sounds straightforward. It isn't. Because re-entry has its own specific dangers, and they're more subtle than anything you navigated in the operating room. The operating room required surrender. Recovery required patience. Re-entry requires something harder than both. It requires you to be fully present in environments that remember an older version of you without reverting to that version simply because the memory is loud. Here's the thing. Every environment you enter carries a script, A script written during the season when you occupied a specific role, expressed a specific energy, responded to pressure in a specific way. That script is stored in the muscle memory of the people around you, in how they address you, what they expect from you, how they frame their requests, how they respond when you don't behave the way the script says you should. And the script isn't malicious. It's just a record of who you were when you were last fully present in that space. The danger isn't the script. The danger is unconsciously performing it, slipping back into the old role, not because you chose it, but because it was handed to you and your hands remembered how to hold it before your mind could intervene. Now watch this. There's a professional environment you're about to step back into, or perhaps you're already navigating it now. Someone in that environment knew you before the operating room, before the sterile field, before the long months of stillness. And they approach you with the familiarity of that prior knowledge. Warm, genuine, perhaps even well-meaning. But embedded in the warmth is an assumption about who you are, what you'll tolerate, how you'll respond, what access they still have to the parts of you that the procedure has since restructured. Here's what regression looks like. You match their assumption, not consciously, just reflexively, because the familiar dynamic activated the familiar response before the rebuilt you had a chance to show up. Here's what re-entry without regression looks like. You receive the warmth genuinely and you respond from your current structure. Not coldly, not with a speech about how you've changed, just differently. Measurably, undeniably differently. And you let the difference speak without explaining it. Stay with me. The most powerful repositioning available to you right now isn't a rebrand. It isn't a new title or a new network or a new set of credentials. It's the consistency of responding from your rebuilt interior across enough interactions that the people around you have to update their script. That update doesn't happen in one conversation. It happens across a pattern of encounters where the person they expected to find isn't the person they keep meeting. And eventually the old script gets retired, not because you demanded it, but because reality made it obsolete. Here's what nobody tells you about positioning. Status isn't claimed, it's demonstrated. The people who understand rooms, who have built genuine authority in their fields, their families, their communities, didn't acquire their position by announcing it. They acquired it by responding to pressure, opportunity, conflict, and invitation in ways that consistently revealed the density of their interior. Your re-entry works the same way. The rooms that matter will adjust to accommodate what you carry, but only if what you carry remains consistent, regardless of whether those rooms are currently applauding or questioning it. Think about that. Rangyoy boundaries don't work when they're built from rules. A rule can be argued with, negotiated around, emotionally pressured until it bends. A structure can't. When your limits emerge not from what you've decided to tolerate, but from what your rebuilt interior simply doesn't operate in anymore, they don't require defense. They just exist. Like the walls of a building that was engineered correctly, they don't need to announce their load-bearing capacity. They just hold. Take a breath right now, because re-entry isn't a destination, it's a practice. Every room you walk into from this point forward is another iteration of the same fundamental question. Are you operating from the rebuilt structure, or are you performing the old one? The answer won't always be perfect, but the trajectory matters more than the perfection. Chosen one. You're not walking back into those rooms as who you were. You're walking in as who the procedure produced. Don't shrink that back into a shape that fits an old expectation. The rooms will adjust. They always do when the structure is real enough and consistent enough and unhurried enough to wait for the adjustment without demanding it. The rooms are adjusting, the structure is holding, and now we arrive at the moment the entire procedure has been moving toward, not with fanfare, not with a ceremony, not with the kind of dramatic resolution that would make for a satisfying ending in a film, with something quieter than that, more permanent than that. When a surgeon discharges a patient, there's no applause in the hallway. There's just a quiet confirmation. The structure is sound, the healing is sufficient, the body can now bear what it couldn't bear before. That's where you are, not at the end of something, at the beginning of the only version of your story that was built to last. Here's the thing, everything covered in these chapters, the sterile field, the incision, the stillness, the recovery, the scar, the structure, none of it was theoretical. It was anatomical. It was a precise description of a real process that has been underway in your life, in your interior, in the places nobody saw and nobody photographed and nobody validated. And the reason it needed to be named chapter by chapter with the specificity it deserved is this: you cannot steward what you haven't understood, and you cannot advance from a procedure you spent the whole time trying to escape. Now watch this. The word discharged carries two meanings, and both of them belong to this moment. The first is release. You're no longer confined to the operating environment. The recovery room has completed its work. You're cleared to move to bare load, to re-enter the full weight of your assignment without the restrictions that a healing structure required. The second meaning is activation to discharge, is also to release stored energy in a directed form. A battery discharges, a weapon discharges, and a person who has been through genuine surgical preparation and genuine recovery discharges into their next season with a concentrated force that the unprepared version could never have accessed. You're not being sent back out as who you were. You're being deployed as what the procedure produced. Stay with me. There will be moments ahead, and they'll come sooner than you expect, where everything the operating room built in you gets tested simultaneously. A financial pressure and a relational strain arriving in the same week. An opportunity that looks exactly right sitting beside a person who belongs to the old script. A room that applauds you loudly on the same day. A room questions you quietly. These aren't accidents. They're the first load-bearing tests of the rebuilt structure. And the response that rises in you in those moments, unhurried, undefended, operating from density rather than anxiety, that response will tell you more about how completely the procedure worked than anything else ever could. Here's what nobody tells you about the life on this side of the operating room. It doesn't feel the way you imagined it would feel during the long months of the sterile field. During the procedure, the mind constructs a picture of the other side, usually a picture involving relief, vindication, the specific satisfactions of being seen and recognized after a long season of invisibility. And some of that does come. But the more significant thing that comes isn't a feeling, it's a capacity. The capacity to hold more without being destabilized, to give more without being depleted, to lead more without performing, to build more without the frantic energy of someone who still doubts their own foundation. That capacity, quiet, functional, structural, is the real harvest. Everything else is downstream from it. Think about that. The people who walked through genuine separation, genuine stillness, genuine recovery, and genuine re-entry don't tend to talk about it loudly. Not because they're hiding it, but because the evidence doesn't require a speech. It's present in how they handle a crisis, how they decline an offer, how they respond when someone underestimates them, how they move through a room where the energy is chaotic and somehow make the room steadier simply by being in it. That's the discharge. That's what stored energy directed by a rebuilt structure looks like in a living, breathing, fully operational human life. Take a breath right now, a full one, the kind that belongs to someone who has come through something real and knows it. Not the breath of relief exactly, though that's present. The breath of readiness, of orientation, of a person who finally has their feet under them in a way that doesn't depend on the floor staying still. Chosen one. The surgeon has completed his work. The incision is closed. The scar is dense. The structure is sound. And the assignment waiting on the other side of this moment is one that required everything the operating room produced in you, not as a suggestion, but as a prerequisite. You weren't hidden to be forgotten. You were finished to be deployed. The procedure is complete. Now, advance. If somewhere in these 10 chapters, a single sentence landed in a place you didn't have language for before today, leave that word, that phrase, that quiet confirmation in the comments below, not for the count, as a marker, a record that you were here, that you heard this, and that something in you recognized it as true. The ones carrying the same frequency will find each other there. And sometimes knowing you're not walking through the operating room alone is the only thing a person needs to stay on the table long enough for the procedure to finish.